Good morning, students. I hope you're all well at home with your families. I want to say thank you to a couple of students who've been sending in more information, and someone even sent me something in the mail. I'm so excited. One student sent me this nice Valentine kind of heart-filled picture, and if you'd ever like to send me something in the mail, you are welcome to. You could just ask your parents to request my street address, my postal address, in an email, and I'll send that to you. I also wanted to compliment another student who sent another picture of their writing, and they have really been paying attention to the details that we've been learning about George Washington, because they wrote about one of those details and illustrated it in a picture. So that was just great to see. Let's take a look at our morning message. March 31st, 2020. Dear students, do you remember how Abe Lincoln loved animals? Well, someone else did too. Mrs. Kilmer. Let's take a closer look at that message. Do you remember? Oh, I see a re word, remember, and I'd like to get some more RE words from you guys. Remember, we are collecting RE words, and I'd like to add some to my list. I only have 3 that were sent in, so let's send in some more of those. Okay, do you remember how Abe Lincoln loved animals? I'm remembering that. Well, someone else did too. Da, da, da. Do you see the ellipses? Are you excited to wonder what the answer is? Who's that someone else? Today I'm going to share with you an information book about George Washington, and I want to be clear, I'm not going to read the whole text. I'm going to read some of it to you and show you some of the pictures. Here we go with George Washington and the General's Dog. Now, some of you have already read this, but I wanted to be sure to share it with everybody. By Frank Murphy, illustrated by Richard Walz. It's a Scholastic. Let's see the back, a blurb on the back of the book. George Washington and the General's Dog. George Washington loved animals. What happened when he found a lost dog in battle? Read this true story and find out. A battle is like a fight during a war when 2 groups come together and fight. That's a battle. Okay, let's see what happens. Oh, there's a cute picture right in the front with 2 cute little smiley dogs. And then on the title page, George Washington and the General's Dog, I see what looks like George Washington, and then I see another kind of big dog with a green collar. So we all know that George Washington is one of America's heroes because we've been learning and reading about that. And we know that he was very honest and he was brave. In fact, that information is right here on our George Washington poster, right? That he was brave, and we know he was honest, but there might be something about him that we don't know, and we're going to learn about that in the book. Let me just go ahead and show you this picture. Oh, look at that funny detail in that portrait. It looks like these kids are in a museum looking at a portrait of George Washington. Oh, and there's some years there, some dates, 1732 to 1799. Oh, I wonder if that's his lifespan. Those are the years, the year he was born and the year he died. George Washington loved animals. And look, it looks like he's standing in front of Mount Vernon. And, oh, isn't that funny? Look, he's holding a bunny. And if I turn back, I can see that detail of some bunny ears sticking up in that portrait. Looks a little connected. George learned to ride horses as a boy. Sometimes he rode into town. George rode fast, but he never fell. People said he was the best rider they had ever seen. And wow, I see how the illustrator has shown this kind of trail of dust to show how fast he's riding. And I also noticed an interesting detail. Here it says Fredericksburg, Virginia General Store. Fredericksburg, that's just a little way south of us here in Arlington, and I think that is the closest kind of big town to where George was born, where George grew up. When George grew up, he moved to a farm called Mount Vernon. Each day, every day, George checked on the horses and hogs. He checked on the oxen, mules, and sheep, but he spent the most time with his dogs. George had a lot of dogs. He owned 36 dogs in his lifetime. He took them hunting, he played with them, he even gave them cute names like Mopsy, Sweetlips, and True Love. And if you get this book yourself, I'm sure you could maybe order it somehow. You can see lots of cute little details here around. On the collars, you can see the initials of each dog to see which one is which. Sometimes George spoiled his dogs. He let them run around the house. One day, George's wife Martha cooked a ham for dinner. George's dog Vulcan jumped up and stole the ham right off the table. Martha chased after him, but George just laughed. Oh, Vulcan. Vulcan, that's the Roman god, like from volcano. I'm making a connection to volcanoes. Well, he exploded when he grabbed that ham, didn't he? George liked being at Mount Vernon with Martha and the animals, but America needed him. America was not yet its own country. It was an English colony. That means it belonged to England. Many American colonists wanted to be free from England, so they went to war. The war was called the American Revolution. The colonists chose George to be their general. George chose his favorite dog, Sweetlips, to go with him. He said goodbye to Martha and Mount Vernon. He jumped on his horse, Nelson. Then he rode into battle. Sweetlips was right beside him. Wow, so this looks similar to the picture back here. Both of them look like they're taken right in front of Mount Vernon, the main building at Mount Vernon. And I also noticed something else. It talks about how it names his horse Nelson, and I'm making a connection to how we named Abe Lincoln two of his horses, right? There was Old Bob and Old Buck. And I think it's important to realize that in the old days, that was the way people went around. We didn't have cars yet, right? So when someone traveled around, they might be in a carriage or a wagon or a buggy, but most people, especially men, learned to ride horseback, and they would go around on their horses. So your horse was really important to you. It was the way you got around everywhere. So you probably did give it a name, and at least the people we've been studying took good care of their horses. So there's Nelson. In George's day, soldiers often brought dogs with them to war. So this is talking about bringing dogs because he brought his favorite dog, Sweetlips. Dogs helped hunt. Dogs helped track the way. Dogs helped guard against wild animals. Best of all, dogs were great partners. Yeah, just like our pets are our great partners now during this time when we have to stay at home, huh? The general of the English army was named William Howe. He had a dog too. He also had 9,000 soldiers. They had plenty of supplies. Oh, I'm making a connection to some of our learning we had yesterday so far, where it talked about how the British had so much more supplies and uniforms and things like that, and often a lot more soldiers than the revolutionaries, than the U.S. soldiers. George did not have nearly as many supplies. Sometimes his soldiers were cold. Sometimes they were hungry, but they did not give up. In the fall of 1777, George's troops went to Pennsylvania. They were fighting the English troops. Guns fired, rat-a-tat-tat. Cannons roared, boom, bang. Smoke filled the air. Finally, the fighting ended. The English soldiers went back to their camp. The battle was over for the day. The smoke began to clear. George noticed a dog without a soldier. It looked lost. George bent down and patted the dog's head. I always think it's funny to notice in this illustration how Sweetlips is over here. And it's like she's looking back like, why are you looking at that, Dog George? You're with me. The dog followed George back to the colonist camp. He wagged his tail. Whose dog is this? Wondered George. George looked at the dog's collar. The tag had a man's name on it. The name was William Howe. William Howe? George couldn't believe his eyes. William Howe was the enemy. And you notice here and there, some of the letters of the words are kind of at a diagonal. Remember, we learned about italics, and italics are another time when the author wants you to give it some oomph. So that's why when I read it, I said, that name was William Howe. William Howe, right? To give it a little oomph. And we can see on the collar, if lost, return to William Howe. You see that on the collar? Word about the enemy dog spread through camp. Some of George's men wanted to keep the dog, but George said no. George believed the dog belonged with his master. George had his friend Alexander Hamilton write a note to General Howe. The note said that George wanted to return the dog. And Alexander Hamilton is the famous person who's you may have heard about because someone wrote a musical about him. And he was George Washington's aide-de-camp, like his helper officer who stayed with him all the time and wrote letters for him and did a lot of stuff for him. That's Alexander Hamilton. Oh, and there's Sweetlips peeking over again. Both sides raised white flags. The white flags meant no one could fight. George's soldiers walked the dog across the battlefield. They gave him back to General Howe. People in England found out about George's good deed. The English still wanted to beat George and win the war, but now they respected him. Some English people even liked him. They had never heard a story of such great kindness between enemies. So I think the setting of this picture is in London because these people are reading a newspaper that's called the London Gazette. Gazette is kind of an old-fashioned word for a newspaper, but even nowadays there are newspapers called gazettes. And the headline is Washington Returns Dog. That's showing the streets of London. In 1783, America won the war against England. America became its very own country. George Washington went home to Mount Vernon. There's a welcome parade, complete with fireworks. Friends around the world wanted to honor George. They wondered what he would like. Then they remembered the story about the dog. Soon presents started arriving at Mount Vernon. The King of Spain sent George a mule. George named him Royal Gift. Kind of like a joke, huh? Royal Gift. And the tag says, to George from King Carlos. King Carlos of Spain. A friend from France gave George an even bigger gift, 7 dogs. And if you read the sign on the crate, it says, from Marquis de Lafayette to George Washington, Mount Vernon. Marquis de Lafayette was a famous French officer who was George Washington's friend and helped him a lot during the war. George's work was not done, though. The American people needed a leader. They elected George to be their first president. People all over America loved their new president. They cheered when he rode by in his carriage. They knew it was him because his 6 white horses always led the way. And what's really cool about this story is that it's true. And we can't know exactly how all the events happened, but basically the story is totally true. And in the back, you can see some detailed pictures. There's a picture here, a portrait of George Washington with Nelson, a portrait of Alexander Hamilton. So there's George Washington on Nelson. Here's Alexander Hamilton. Here's a drawing of General Howe. And here is a picture of the actual note that Alexander Hamilton wrote to General Howe. This is the real thing, a picture of the real thing. Just like we saw, I'm making a connection to the pictures of the letters written from Grace Bedell to Abe Lincoln to suggest that he add whiskers, that he grow a beard, and from Abe Lincoln back to her. So isn't it great? It's so cool, I think, and so much fun to study history when we can get a look at what we call primary sources. That's when we can actually see an object, a thing from that time that tells the story. To learn history that way is really, I think, the funnest. Anyway, I hope you enjoyed that story about George Washington and the General's dog. And actually, I have a packet of questions that I will email out to everyone. And please don't think that you have to write all the questions, but for some students, it might be a fun challenge. Part of the challenge in the packet is using full sentences. So you want to be sure that you use a capital at the beginning, period at the end. But it has some fun questions about the content of the story, as well as some questions for students to reflect on. So you could use that packet, either have your child fill it out themselves, or you could just use it to talk to them about the book. So I'll send that out in an email today. Hope you have a nice morning, and I'll see you this afternoon for our afternoon story.